Selamat kembali ke episod terkini Keluar Sekejap bersama Dr. Ong Kian Ming dan juga Dr. Apurva Sanghi daripada Bank Dunia. Apurva, before the break, we were talking and I threw you a question around your impressions about the Madani economic narrative and whether it was the right narrative. Maybe let me add on another question to that. Do you think it's achievable? Not just does it sound good, but will it work?
Right. So the way I interpret the Madani framework is it is saying something quite straightforward and intuitive. It's saying that development is not just about raising average incomes. Everybody needs to benefit from growth and development. It needs to be inclusive and it needs to be done in a sustainable manner, right? And there are things that go beyond just raising growth rates or so on and so forth. So you have to take into account cultural, social, historical factors into development. And I totally agree with that. It's development, again, it's not just about GDP growth rates, so on and so forth. And a good manifestation of that, if you look at the 2024, the budget, is increase in sort of social cash assistance. Now, it might not be enough, and you can argue around all that, but it's a good manifestation of how a Madani principle is actually being implemented on the ground. Now, so I like the narrative, and I have to say I equally like the Keluar Malaysia narrative from the previous administration. It's about making families and households strong. So I think people have their narratives, and this was a good one. The issue, not with Madani per se, with narratives in general, is that at the end of the day, as I said, it's about doing, it's about implementing, right? And in the case of Malaysia, the reforms have to be at an economy-wide level, because the structural problems are not going to go away with this narrative or that. So what are the structural problems? Things such as over-reliance on commodity revenues, fiscally speaking, the issue of skills that we touched upon, lack of nutrition for most kids in Malaysia. Right, so these things have to be resolved on an economy-wide level, and we touched upon it earlier, making the economy more competitive in certain areas and bringing in more investment and so on and so forth. So this is where I think Malaysia needs to focus on. So solving these structural constraints.
So Apurva, you talked about doing, and I think all of us were involved in this kind of policy debate in one way or another, which is the over-reliance of Malaysia on foreign workers, which has an impact on wages, which also drags down investment, both private, especially on the private side, in terms of investing in more machines and things of that nature. And we've also kicked the can down the road on the implementation of something called the multi-tiered levy for foreign workers. So what is your view in terms of this kind of challenge that Malaysia faces, and any things that we can do in terms of overcoming this challenge?
And Apurva, just before you answer, I just want to give you some, at least my experience sitting in cabinet about foreign workers. And I remember a previous Prime Minister, I think it was Pak many years ago, said that we were addicted to a few things, and one was foreign workers. And I saw that when I was in cabinet, because there's always been this statement of intent from successive prime ministers and governments saying that we want to reduce foreign workers. The moment the economy slows down, the moment, well, it was COVID as well, or the moment economy slows down, the moment there are global headwinds, the representations will come from manufacturing, will come from the furniture industry, will come from different sectors saying, can we have 1,000? Can we have 6,000? That becomes 10,000. That becomes, and then restaurants and mission creep again, where every single sector is asking for foreign workers, and everyone's like, okay, we'll get on the foreign worker gravy train again. So this is a classic case where statement of intent and implementation, there's a huge gulf, because it's so easy to say, let's approve another 50,000 from Bangladesh, from Nepal, from Vietnam, or wherever it is.
Right. So I have to say that we haven't done any analysis on the issue of foreign workers in Malaysia. So I'm going to share with you my emerging thoughts, subject to change. Sure. And I've heard this issue a lot, that foreign workers are in many ways a bane in Malaysia, and we are addicted to foreign workers, etc. And I just wonder to what extent is that really true? Now, if you look at most of the jobs that foreign workers do, they are what you guys call the 3D jobs, right? So, and COVID offered a natural experiment in many ways. So when you had all the constraints in terms of incoming foreign labor, etc., when the economy started opening up, how many firms, Malaysian firms and Malaysian workers actually ran in to fill in those jobs or automated
They were not
to
able
become
to.
more productive? Not many, right? So I think it's easy to point one's fingers at foreign workers as a root of all malaise. Malaise as in,
Yeah,
you know what I mean, right? So, and I forget where I read this in either the Star or the Edge. The latest is where foreign workers were being blamed for the ringgit depreciation.
Because we repatriate a lot.
Remittance.
Yeah, and if you look at the trends as a percentage of GDP,
it's
actually
tiny.
repatriation
It's
had actually gone down by foreign workers when the ringgit had depreciated the most. So I don't necessarily buy into the notion that foreign workers are the problem per se. The issue again goes back to the lack of competitiveness in the Malaysian economy. The fact that the Malaysian economy tends to be dominated by a few large firms. And let me share one statistic with you. About 3% of large firms generate over 60% of output and employ over half of all employees. Right? So if it's so top heavy, where is the competition? GLCs are classified as private enterprise in Malaysia, which sort of surprises me to the day. So the issue is when you talk about foreign workers as a cause for Malaysia not moving up the productivity ladder, are foreign workers really the issue, or is the fact that there's really not enough competition among Malaysian companies, among Malaysian GLCs? There's not enough private enterprise that firms tend to not compete and therefore not move up the productivity ladder.
So my personal view, guys, is maybe foreign workers is the prevalence of it is more a symptom as opposed to a cause, right? It's
And they're
because
more
that-
visible too, right? So it's very
Sure.
easy to.
and it plays into certain, not so pleasant xenophobic tropes
But-
sometimes.
I'm very glad to hear
But
that.
Kemeng, you were at MITI. Coming back, yes, it is a symptom to some extent. But what was this, the almost laziness of companies after all the incentives we've given for automation, for trying to make sure that the capital investment increases, but still they will come back and say, I need foreign workers.
It's an easy way out because, like you just said, the manufacturers and others would know. Once you put pressure on the government would
Cave.
And I've seen this, when I've attended meetings whereby they said, okay, government said we're going to introduce the multi-tier levy. The business.
Can you explain a bit?
The multi-tier levy basically says that if you employ X percentage of foreign workers.
Kalau banyak, you have to pay more lah.
Yes, correct. Yeah. So if over 75% of your workforce is foreign workers, you have to pay more in terms of the additional levy.
Disincentive.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So they say, yeah, fine, we agree on it, but implement it next year. So in the meantime, then the next year will become the next year and next year and next year, and then it suddenly becomes perpetuity. But I would push back on what Apurva said a little bit, in terms of talking about the competitiveness area. I would say that many of our companies are also, not being fair to our own workers in the sense that rather than to pay, let's say, 2,000, 2,005 above the minimum wage, or even to pay overtime for our local workers, they would say, look, this will increase our cost base by too much because we're paying too much to our own people. And they said, okay, you can't fill that role, just give it to the foreign workers. And the irony is that you actually end up spending more because you're talking about additional levies, you're talking about needing additional housing for the foreign workers and whatnot. So I've seen this in action by some companies. I won't name them. And my friend, our good friend Liu Chin Tong, he's said publicly, if you are willing to pay a certain percentage of the salary that what Singapore offers in ringgit terms, I think many of the workers Malaysian workers who are doing some of these 3D jobs in Singapore may consider coming back. So just a little bit of pushback on that.
So I would love to push back against your pushback. Sure. So if you look at wages in Malaysia, and that's a very important issue, we all sort of know that wages are low in Malaysia, and that's a common refrain. But you have to ask, low compared to what? compared to whom? They are definitely low compared to Singapore, for example. If you look at wage growth in Malaysia is actually lower than in many ASEAN countries. If you look at Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, still above Philippines and at par with Indonesia. So using these regional benchmarks, wage growth has been low. So wage growth in Malaysia over the last 10, 12 years is has been about 12% or so, something like that, right? But then you have to benchmark wage growth with productivity growth. Okay, and it goes back to the very interesting question Shahril asked me, and I apologize if it's getting economies, but interestingly, if you look at the data in Malaysia, and again, we like to be informed by data evidence analysis, wage growth has been above productivity growth in Malaysia, and universally across all sectors based on the latest data we have. And this is a really important point that does not get discussed enough. So Malaysian workers may be lowly paid compared to other countries, but they're not being underpaid compared to their productivity within Malaysia. So wages are low because productivity is low. That's a really important point. It goes back to how do you increase productivity?
So what is your view on, and we don't know the details yet because this white paper has not been tabled in Parliament yet, but the Minister for Economy, Rafizi, has announced this progressive wage model, which presumably is some progressive intervention by the government, similar, if not exactly the same, to a tripartite model that Singapore does, where you sort of sit down with the unions and you sit down with the employers and you sort of decide some sort of median wage according to sectors, according to job functions and things like that. But if productivity is not kept up with wage growth, then what are we talking about here?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, based on the facts and figures, wage growth is above productivity growth in every sector that we have seen. So by forcing wages to go up without commensurate increases in productivity, you're not going to get much. You're not going to get anywhere. That is my view, right? It's just basic Econ 101. You have to have productivity growth commensurate with wage growth. Otherwise, it's just a recipe for more inflation. Now, let me give you a concrete example for your viewers. Now, Singapore is cited by many as a good example of the progressive wage model, if you will. Now, if you look at what happened in the early 80s in Singapore, so Singapore had the National Wage Council in the early 80s recommended, again, I forget the numbers, some 11-12% increase in wages, which was adopted. Soon after which, Singapore went through its first post-independence recession. Now, there are many factors, external, domestic, but one internal factor contributing to the recession was this sort of almost forced increase in wages. And in the context of productivity growth not keeping pace. And then the Economic Advisory Council in Singapore had to backtrack. They had to say, okay, we need to move towards, we cannot go down this path anymore. We need to make wages more flexible, more market-driven. So people forget about this episode in Singapore's history, the first recession ever in Singapore's history, right? So it's regarding the specifics of the PWM, the progressive wage model. Let's see what it says. But from what I understand, it is now not mandatory. It's a voluntary opt-in, which is fine. And by voluntary opt-in, from what I understand, is that a firm sign up for
they get some incentives.
They get some incentives, but then the question is at what cost?
Exactly.
Right. So we don't know. Let's wait for the details. But I do agree with YB Rafizi and Mr. Rafizi in one thing, that there needs to be a clear exit policy for whoever signs up for this, and that I think is sensible. And finally, on the progressive wage model, I would say that if you look at experience around you, if you are going to go down that road, Australia is a good example of a relatively successful progressive wage type model. And the keys to its success was to make the wage increases very clear, make them gradual, so small increments, gradual, and very transparent. Right? So if you're going to go down that road, I mean, there are some examples out there.
Yeah, just one last thing that I'll say about this, which is, you brought up the Singapore example. Their progressive wage model is actually limited to only 3 or 4 professions.
Right.
Yeah.
Mostly at the lower end.
That's the
and
anchor, no?
On the Singapore side as well.
But Shahril's point is that it's an anchor, and it in theory it's supposed to put this pressure on other
rest.
sectors as well.
But I think the more important thing that Singapore did was to signal to private industry that they would have a tightening of the foreign labor requirements and also quota. They still do have that, but then it's going to get more and more expensive over time. They stuck to that policy, and because of that, a lot of those kind of more labor-intensive industries actually shifted to other places, China, some to Malaysia, and then more capital investment came into play, and then you had higher wages. So it was, it was a virtuous cycle, and I hope that Malaysia can go towards that direction.
Just a quick pushback, Apurva, and I think we'd be remiss if we didn't question this narrative that always employers say we can't raise wages because productivity is not growing so fast. So I think maybe just discuss a bit more about that, because the MADANI MADANI framework has one goal: to increase the portion of salary to GDP. So I think 40-odd%, 45%. So that suggests it is lower than it should be, or it's lower than what we want to achieve as a developed economy. How does one, as an economist, explain those two things, having low productivity or wages increasing faster than productivity, but at the same time, the portion of the national income that goes to wages is still lower? Meaning, suggesting that shareholders, capital owners got money.
Yeah. So a great question. You guys are really asking me easy questions here, I see. So listen, let me reiterate. Wages are low in Malaysia because productivity is low. Okay, if you want to increase wages, you increase productivity, and we spoke about some measures. Then this compensation share of labor versus capital. As an economist, I have to say I scratch my head and wonder about it. If it's a goal in and of itself,
or a symptom.
Or a symptom. So the correct way of assessing well-being is income per capita, real income per capita, if you want to be technical. It's not the share of income going to labor. And the share of income going to labor, the problems I have with that notion is that, first of all, it's as if you're taking from capital and giving to labor. It's redistributive. And remember, we spoke about how capital investments have been declining. So if anything, Malaysia needs more investments, right? So there's a dichotomy in that notion or that narrative first. The second is that it really depends on the structure of the economy. So if you look at just oil and gas in Malaysia, that is highly capital intensive. The labor share is, I think, in the 20s, right? But the median wage or even the mean wage in the oil and gas sector is much higher than in other sectors. So we're really barking up the wrong tree when we want to say, let's increase this 30% to 40+%. Again, the real issue is you want to improve well-being, you want to improve incomes per capita, and it's all about productivity growth.
That was my way of making you criticize or critique the Madani narrative.
No, I'm just speaking as an economist. It's not about critiquing this or that.
Let's go back to basics now and talk the language of the man on the street, the person on the street, rather. Rashid Ghaffur, the governor of the central bank, made a statement a couple of days ago about the third quarter, expanded 3.3%. Headline inflation moderated to 2%. Top line, things look pretty good. Of course, it's moderated from last year. High base effect. Last year was a exceptional rebound. Thanks to the opening up after COVID, the pandemic. But coming back to this issue of the disconnect between the headline numbers and what people are feeling on the street, how does an economist explain this? Because I couldn't explain it as a politician. Why are the headline numbers for GDP so good? The IPP numbers good. Everything seems to be trending north, but I go to the pasar, I go to the supermarket, I go to the market to spend, and my ringgit is not going as far as it used to.
Right. Okay, so first of all, let me say that what Governor Rashid has said is, of course, all correct and all true, and I second all the headline numbers. But there is a disconnect, I think, between these headline numbers and how the rakyat feels on the ground. And top of my head, I can think of three reasons, and let me elaborate on each of these. So it's the emphasis on growth, then looking at inflation and jobs. These are things that really matter to any one of us, right? So let's talk about growth. So when we say growth was X last year and is Y this year, of course growth is important, no denying that. But again, you cannot eat growth. So growth is felt differently by different people. And the way most people feel it is through per capita sort of income. How much are their incomes increasing? You could have blockbuster growth, but if it's being captured by a few, it doesn't affect most of us, right? So, and if you look at real capita per incomes, they have been increasing in Malaysia, which is a good thing, but still, and they're above pre-COVID levels. But if you think of a world where before COVID, real capita per incomes were going, current real capita per incomes are still below that. And it's a mental thing. Most of us want to feel whole in some ways. We want to go back to our lives before COVID. And that is a mental model I think, my hunch is most of us have. And so even real per capita incomes haven't caught up to that, right? So that's one. So this emphasis on growth versus what really matters, standards of living, I think we need to be more transparent about this. The second is inflation. Now, we keep hearing that the pace of inflation has come down. Spot on, absolutely, that's the case. But saying that inflation is coming down is like saying if you're bleeding less.
Because it's still inflation.
Right, you're still bleeding, right? You may be bleeding less, but you're still bleeding. So what do I mean by that? The pace of inflation may be coming down, but that doesn't mean that prices are coming down. And this is something that the Rakyat, right? I mean, they're not economists and they're not supposed to understand it, but when they hear statements, inflation is coming down, they go to the grocery store and see prices are still up. So obviously they're going to feel that a disconnect right there. And to just elaborate on this a bit more, if you look at, again, the pace of inflation is about 1.9% this year, down from, but this comes on top of 3.5% last year and 2.4% the year before. So the cumulative inflation, is about 7% or so, right? So prices have risen over the last 2 years by 7%. And worst is food prices. The cumulative inflation is 12%, 11 or 12%, right? And why is this important? Because most of the B10, B40, about a quarter of their incomes goes towards food. So again, when you go to the grocery store or to the pasar and you see that rice prices are still or food prices are still high, obviously there's going to be a disconnect, right? So and then finally the third thing I mentioned was jobs. Again, you look at headline unemployment numbers, they are down to 3.3, 3.4%. Great, but scratch under the surface, there's a lot of underemployment. So Malaysia is in this unenviable position where Malaysia is, as we know, is exporting high skills and importing low skills. And if you look at, and even the skills that it has, they're being underutilized. So as economists use something called a skills-based underemployment employment figure, and that has steadily risen. It's now up to 35, 36%. So think of your Grab driver who has a graduate degree or a college degree, but driving Grab to make ends meet. So not fully utilizing the skills. So these are the reasons why I think there's a gap between the headline numbers, which are not wrong, but they're not fully explained, and what the Rakyat feels on the ground.
Apurva, you've been in Malaysia for 2 years now.
2 glorious years.
2 glorious years,
Yes.
not yet one too many mornings, if you got that reference.
Yes, Dylan.
What are some of your more interesting observations beyond beyond the economy, just what you've seen? I hope you've fallen in love with the country.
Yeah, that's a good question. So let me share a few. So one is that in the 2 years I've been here, I've celebrated 2 Chinese New Years, 2 Deepawalis, 2 Vesaks, 4 Eids, Hari Rayas, some 2 Thayapusams. You get my drift, right? So, and if you look at it, the way I look at it is that Malaysia is an incredibly multicultural society. I mean, cultural diversity is Malaysia's strength, and not very many countries have that. Let's be honest.
Do we sell it enough, though?
So I came from Russia. Really, not that much cultural diversity. A lot of intra-country diversity, but Malaysia's strength is cultural diversity. But the question I ask myself is whether Malaysia has been able to harness this multi-ethnicity, multicultural diversity into economic strength. And I'm not sure that the answer is all that optimistic in the 2 years I have been here. But you guys are Malaysians, you tell me. But that's my first sort of passing observation. And the second I would say is that I was surprised for a country like Malaysia, which is almost at high income status, there's a lack of public intellectuals. And this is something I've shared privately with many, and they all agree.
You're looking at it, Kian Ming and Cheryl. Kian Ming and Cheryl.
This is as good as it
This is the
gets,
sum
you
of
know.
public intellectuals, Kian Ming and Cheryl. I'm just the third wheeler here. This is it.
So what do I mean by public intellectual? One category is heavy-duty academics. If you think of Paul Krugman in the US, who have broken away from the academic mold and out there engaging with the public in provocative discourse, trying to move the needle. Things I don't really see.
We have Professor Kes Jomo, in that mold. Yeah.
Jomo, we have Farish.
You can count them in the fingers of your one hand. But one person I have a lot of admiration for, whom I would classify as a public intellectual, is Andrew Sheng. But he's known much more outside of Malaysia than inside Malaysia, right?
Yep.
So that's the second thing. But let me say that Malaysians are blessed, right? So this country has so much going for it. It's not in the ring of fire like Philippines or Vietnam, for example, or Indonesia, for example. It has a reasonably domestic size sort of market, unlike neighboring Singapore. You guys bash yourself up comparing yourself to Singapore, but a lot of potential here in terms of food security and whatnot. The fact that there's a deep domestic institutional investor database, so you're not reliant on foreign borrowings as much. So there's so many strengths and so much potential, and let's not forget the food, of course. But that's a given. But can I share one thing that really struck me? So after 5 years of living in Russia, I come here, and I was amazed that each time my wife or I drew open the curtains in the morning, you guys are blessed with sunshine. Okay, and that's something that you take for granted. In the very first year, I moved to Russia, December 2016, and you can Google it, I'm not making it up, in the entire month of December, 31 days, Moscow got less than 10 minutes of sunshine. All right? So it's very anecdotal, but just to say that Malaysia has so much going for it.
And that's renewable energy for you right now.
Renewable energy, yeah.
Apurva, sorry, just still on current issues before we try to wrap things up, and you've been very generous with the time. Another thing that people are upset about right now is the value of our currency. That comes back to how their ringgit doesn't go very far right now because the ringgit is quite weak, and of course it causes imports to be more expensive. Is there a quick fix to this, or do we just have to ride this out?
So there's no quick fix. And the reason why any currency, let alone the ringgit, moves when the currency is somewhat flexible, it's not pegged, is external factors and domestic factors. Right? And we all know that the way the US has hiked up its interest rates, that's causing a lot of grievances in many parts of the world. And in some ways, the ringgit is appreciating because of what's happening in the US, right? But let me say this on the record, that I have a lot of faith in Bank Negara. I hear criticisms privately, but each time I interact with them, going back to access to policymakers, and I think they are doing as good a job as any bank in terms of balancing the volatility and so on and so forth of the ringgit. Now, a couple of points on the ringgit. So one thing I've seen many, no naming names here, but many say that, it's because of external factors. That is true. Most of the fluctuation today is because of external factors. It's not only that. It's also domestic factors that don't get enough attention paid to. And
Such as
we spoke about the decline of investment to GDP from 40+% to 19-odd%, right? So, or the decline of exports to GDP from 120% down to 68%. So all this reduces the demand for ringgit through FDI and trade. So, you also have to look domestically. Let me give you another example. In the latest Malaysia Economic Monitor we put out, we discussed how we analyzed how the 1 MDB shock affected the value of the ringgit. And it's quite interesting. This happened during 2014, 2015. the same time as the oil price shock, right? As the oil price crisis. So the oil price, so the impact on the ringgit depreciation back then, the oil price was a lesser factor than the 1 MDB shock. So, so there are a lot of, you cannot avoid domestic reasons.
Yeah.
So, fixing your governance system. Now, of course, we have moved a long way from 1 MDB days, but still a lot of improvement to enhance, to improve governance. So, it's, what you do domestically within your borders also makes a huge difference.
Yeah.
And I think it's sometimes too easy to point to external
Yes.
factors and not pay enough attention to what's happening domestically.
factors. I mean, from a trade perspective, there are many exporters, both local and foreign, who are keeping their US dollar earnings outside the country and not wanting to bring them back, partly because of uncertainty in Malaysia, right? But since you brought up Bank Negara, I'll be a little bit naughty here. And we talked about your Chicago PhD and the kind of thinking that also was promulgated by prominent Chicago economists on rational expectations, right? So this is where I think we were in the UK when Tony Blair and Gordon Brown decided to give a lot more independence to the Bank of England.
First announcement they made.
Exactly,
Yeah.
right. So that gave them somewhat shield from the political pressures
Right.
of wanting to raise or lower interest rates depending on political expediency. Do you think that is an issue that's affecting Malaysia in terms of the executive wanting to impose its views and perhaps make unintentionally making people who are looking at the Malaysian market a little bit uneasy with regards to possible interference with our monetary policy?
So from my own experience, from what I see, it's a no. I don't see any political interference per se, but I will be fair. I've heard people say there is, but from my experience, it's a no. But just one final thing on the ringgit. I think I can totally understand why, of course, ringgit depreciation hurts many. Your ringgit doesn't go as much, but it is not the only metric of how to measure an economy's strength. So I do want to say that. And if I could sort of give my one sentence summary of how I feel about the Malaysian economy is that, Malaysia is never as bad as it seems. The economy is never as bad as it seems, but it is never as good as it can be either.
Apurva, I want to, for me, this is the last bit. It's a quick fire round. So I'm going to throw 4 questions at you, and it's not a one word answer. You can elaborate, but let's keep it tight. And I'm going to start with the ringgit first. So Cheryl and I just recently interviewed this guy. He's 98 years old right now. He has some experience in governance, and he served in the government before briefly. He says he did this in 1998. He pegged the ringgit. Should we peg the ringgit?
No. The world has moved on. Malaysia has learned a lot from the days of the Asian financial crisis. In particular, the banking sector is on much more terra firma, much more solid ground. So, and there's really no need to peg the ringgit. That would just send the wrong signals to the investor community.
Second quick fire question. Just before you came on, Kian Meng, Cheryl and I were talking about a cabinet reshuffle. This is about governance. I'm mindful that you don't want to touch on the politics of this country, but in terms of governance, should the Prime Minister also be the Minister of Finance in any country?
It depends. The classic economic
Wow.
answer. Third question.
Moving on.
Okay. Third question, GST, yes or no?
A qualified yes. And let me elaborate on it because that's an important one. So we know that, we're talking earlier of how when you went with your proposal to Treasury, they would say, well, we don't have the funds. And the backdrop to that is if you look at Malaysia's revenue raising capacity, and it's a well-known figure that has gone down drastically. Tax revenue GDP is now 12% compared to other countries, similar countries where it's about 20%. So Malaysia clearly needs to, so the way I like putting it is Malaysia has gone down from a medium revenue, medium spending equilibrium to a low revenue, low spending equilibrium. But here's a rub, guys. Malaysia needs to spend more, not less. It needs to spend better, of course, plugging all the
Fiscal
leakages
spending,
and all that, but it needs to spend more. It's an aging society.
Yep.
Healthcare spending.
Healthcare spending,
NIMP.
climate change, defense, given where the world is headed. so on and so forth. And for it to spend more, it needs to raise more. Right? So at some point, Malaysia will need to address what is the best way to raise more money. Now, it's a qualified yes, because GST comes with drawbacks, it's regressive, but there are ways to address it. But GST is, I've been on record previously saying, it's a lean and mean machine to raise revenues, but you have to address the regressivity issue.
Last one, on a A to F scale, grade the economic performance of this government thus far.
I'm not going to throw out any numerical grades. I think the current government is also facing a lot of legacy issues. The main issues in Malaysia are structural. And one thing we didn't touch upon, if I have the liberty of touching upon it, is what's happening subnationally. So we talk of Malaysia as one entity of unit of analysis. But if you think of it, where does future growth come from? It's really unlocking the potential of state-led growth. And Malaysia is a federation, but it's remarkable as a relative newcomer, it's a very tightly held federation, right? So the fact that if you have to build a school or a hospital in the remote areas of Sabah, you still have to go to Putrajaya in many ways to get permission. That is such a that needs to evolve. Let's put it that way. So, is it possible for me to ask you guys
Yes,
some
before these
questions?
guys wrap up, yeah, go ahead.
Okay,
Yeah.
and
Can I
Don't-
just say that seeing as to how you answered the 4 questions and skirted around some of the more controversial ones, you should consider a career in politics at some point. Anyway, go ahead.
Maybe not in India, but
so this is don't mind, yeah. So and feel free to edit it if you will. So before I came on the show, and again, thanks very much for having me, and thanks for entertaining me in English. But one common refrain I've heard about your show, which is incredibly successful, yeah, is that you two are privileged gentlemen running the show and shaping public opinion. Who sort of gave you this right, if I can use that word? I mean, it's not a right per se, but how do you reconcile your privilege with, spreading the word far? Or might you be biased in the way you look at things?
I think recognizing the privilege is where you begin. That's not just for the show, but I think in life one should. But once you do that, I think it's also trying to not compensate, but make sure that our views reflect our own experiences on the ground, which I think we have a bit of, right, considering our previous life, and also the conversations we have with ordinary people. And I think once you have that awareness and also that desire to ensure that your views and what we bring on the show truly reflect in a fair and equitable way what we think is right, then we go as far as we can to deal with that.
Fair enough. And the sort of last question at my end is that I did say gentlemen, and correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah. Can I just add to that?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. Again, this might come off elitist, but there is a sense of noblesse oblige. Privilege, with privilege comes responsibility. That doesn't mean that if you are not privileged, you have no responsibility. Everyone does. But I think especially if you have had advantages and opportunities, you have to try your best to contribute. And we don't pontificate from our podcast. We don't lecture and hector people. Our express motto is actually to reduce the gulf in talking about current issues, political issues, economic issues, by speaking about them in very, very easy and using easy language. So I think it's one thing if we're very ideologically driven and trying to sell a particular worldview. We're interested in people's worldview. That's why we start with that question every time we interview someone. And we certainly don't peddle what we believe are our own biases. Of course, we are very opinionated people. That's for sure. nobody has given us a right to do this. We are competing in a big marketplace.
Right. Yeah. That didn't. Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's a marketplace of
it's
ideas.
a marketplace. Yeah. Sure.
And Apurva, you said Malaysia is short on public intellectuals. So I don't think that people with previous opportunities or privileged people should surrender that opportunity to participate just because of that.
Fair enough. And you did notice in my question I said gentlemen, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you haven't had any women on the show yet.
We had one.
Oh, you did?
We,
Okay.
it's been a consistent bugbear for us.
Yes, it has.
In fact,
Privately. We have a list.
It's an
You have a list,
absolute internal turmoil for Sharil and I that we've not done enough.
Okay.
We had Amira Aisha, who's the now acting president of MUDA.
Yes.
Sadiq's number 2. She's now stepped up. We want to get more. In fact, we've listed down a few, and we're reaching out.
So can I make a suggestion? I've seen this in other countries I've worked in interviews when you have things like this. You always ask an outgoing guest, like in this case me, who would I recommend who's not from my discipline or field? And maybe you can start that just as an idea. And
Sure.
if you were to start it, I have a recommendation.
Sure.
I recently came across Mazlan Othman, if I remember.
Yeah,
pronouncing that
astrophysicist.
correctly. Highly impressive. Malaysia's first female astrophysicist. So full of you know her better than I do. You know, get her to talk about innovation, about gender issues, about science. You were in MOSTI, Khairi.
Yep.
So that's my recommendation.
No, it's good. It's a good pivot. I think we've been very politics focused, and unfortunately, there are increasing number of women involved in politics. But I think at the leadership level and those who we've, I suppose, interviewed, we've not had that opportunity. But now we want to move away from just
bit
politics.
broader.
And Tan Sri Mazlan is a great suggestion. Thank you for that.
So is
suggestion.
Azalina on the list? I just wondering.
She's not on the list. She's not on the list.
Okay,
Kasih.
Kian Meng and Sharil, why don't you guys close this?
A couple of quick fire ones as well. Is Malaysia ready for carbon tax? If not, if yes, when? Because I know the World Bank is doing a bit of this.
It is getting ready. So it's not ready to have one tomorrow, but hopefully in a year plus, it should be ready.
Is Malaysia ready for some sort of a national health insurance program?
I think Malaysia needs an insurance program, especially for the informal workers and people who are outside the formal insurance. You can call it whatever, but yes. Okay. And there are moves towards that, I believe.
Are we ready this year to, and this will be my last one, to gradually reduce our petrol subsidies? Next year. Are we ready next year?
I really hope so. And the way I look at it is that in this budget, the fact that diesel and electricity have been marked for subsidy rationalization is a step for the elephant in the room, which is RON 95 subsidies.
I'll be a bit kinder, so not so much quick fire. Just maybe a quick one around.
I hope there's a Dylan question in there.
You can bake Dylan into the answer.
Okay.
Any thoughts, World Bank thoughts, your own thoughts around this push for degrowth, considering we've been talking this entire episode and most people talk about growth and how you get to growth, but I think we should address a bit briefly your thoughts on this alternative view that growth itself shouldn't necessarily be the goal for countries.
I agree. Growth is
and climate,
always,
given climate, sorry. Yeah.
So growth is a means to an end, and the end is ultimately improving the welfare. And if you're increasing your growth by burning down your forests or cutting down trees, that's the kind of growth I don't subscribe to. But I'm also not a fan of the degrowth movement. And give you one very practical example. When COVID struck, and it's not just Malaysia, but world over, in some ways you could argue that the world went through a degrowth phase. People were out of jobs, people were miserable. That's not the kind of world we would want to live in.
Okay, I think it's been great.
Apurva Sangi, lead economist from the World Bank. Thank you for coming on Keluar Sekejap, and we hope to continue this conversation at some point in the future.
Thanks very much, guys. Look forward to being on the show again at some point if you wish.
Terima kasih kepada semua. Saya tahu episod yang agak panjang, tetapi feedback daripada episod dengan Tuan Dr. Mahathir, ramai juga listeners dan juga penonton Keluar Sekejap yang suka kepada
Yang penyabar.
episod yang yang panjang-panjang. Thank you guys. Thank you.
Terima kasih.